Imagine waking up one morning in August 1914, not in your own bed, but on a rough straw mattress inside a crowded barracks somewhere in Germany. The dim light of early dawn filters through a small, dusty window, casting long shadows over dozens of young men stirring around you. The air is thick, with the sharp scent of wool uniforms, worn leather boots, and the unmistakable musk of sweat from too many bodies packed into a tight space. You feel the coarse fabric of your field gray uniform against your skin, stiff and scratchy after months of wear. Your boots are heavy and scuffed, fitting as if they have been molded to your feet. The sharp clang of a bell outside jolts everyone into action. "Schnell, schnell, quick, quick," they shout. There is no time to hesitate. You know the routine. You dress, check your gear, strap on your rifle loaded with 5 rounds, and prepare to step into a world that has suddenly changed forever. War has been declared, and you are now part of the Kaiser's army, swept up in a wave of national pride and fierce determination. Around you, voices buzz with confident talk of a swift campaign. We will be home by Christmas, they say. We will march through Belgium, knock out France, then face Russia later. It will be over before you know it. The excitement is contagious. You want to believe it too. But beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingers. You can't shake a feeling deep inside that this won't be as simple as everyone hopes. You glance around at your comrades, some grin with youthful bravado, others wear expressions you can't quite read. None of you know the true horrors ahead, yet all are bound by the same sense of duty and the same questions about survival. Outside the barracks, the streets are alive with cheers. Townsfolk line the sidewalks, waving flags and tossing flowers as your regiment marches toward the waiting trains. Girls smile and old men salute, sending you off with hopeful eyes. The journey west toward Belgium begins, and the mood feels almost festive, a strange contrast to the deadly battles that await. This is the story of what it might have been like to live and fight as a German soldier in World War I. A story of courage, fear, endurance, and the harsh realities of a war unlike any before. Together we will explore the sights, sounds, and emotions of life on the front lines, from the first steps into battle to the grueling days in the trenches, and finally to the uncertain days after. The guns fall silent. If you enjoy uncovering history's most intense and personal stories, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these moments to life and ensures you won't miss the next journey into the past. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let us step back in time to August 1914 when your world changed forever. The morning light barely reaches the crowded room where you find yourself waking up. The air thick and heavy with the scent of damp wool and worn leather. Around you, dozens of other soldiers stir, their movements slow and sluggish from exhaustion and the weight of what lies ahead. The barracks is no place of comfort, narrow wooden bunks packed tightly side by side, straw-stuffed mattresses that barely soften the hardness beneath, and a cold draft that sneaks through cracks in the walls. Chilling skin beneath threadbare uniforms. Your own uniform feels stiff and scratchy, the fabric coarse against your skin. And though it has been washed a dozen times, the greenish-gray color has faded to a dull tone that barely resembles the proud shade it once was. The silver buttons gleam faintly, polished just enough not to draw unnecessary attention from enemy sharpshooters. There is little room for privacy here. The men share whispered conversations, soft coughs, and the occasional nervous laugh, all blending into a symphony of anxious anticipation. The rough, basic food that fills your bread bag and tin canteen is little more than sustenance. Chunks of dense dark bread, a small portion of salted meat or cheese when you are lucky, and a bitter, weak coffee substitute made from roasted grains that can hardly mask the dull taste of the early morning. It is hardly a feast, but it is fuel for the long days ahead. Still, hunger is a familiar companion, and every bite feels like a reminder of the stark difference between this life and the peaceful days left behind. Amid these harsh conditions, however, a different kind of strength holds the room together, a strong sense of duty, an unspoken bond among the men who have been called to serve their country. It is a feeling born not only from orders and discipline, but also from a deep-rooted national pride that courses through every man's veins. The words of the Kaiser echo faintly in the back of your mind, promising glory, honor, and a swift victory that will make this sacrifice meaningful. This is not just a war fought on distant fields. It is a defense of home, family, and the future of Germany itself. You sense that this shared purpose is what sustains the men through the biting cold nights and the grueling marches. A hope that whatever lies ahead, they will face it together. Even as you prepare your gear and listen to the commands shouted across the barracks, you notice the rituals that bring order to chaos. Each soldier methodically checks his rifle, ensuring the Mauser 98 is clean and ready, the bayonet sharp and securely attached. You practice the drills until your hands move without thought, muscles remembering every motion, even when your mind races with questions and doubts. The camaraderie among the men offers a small comfort. Whispered jokes, encouragements, and shared stories briefly cut through the looming shadow of war. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension simmers the knowledge that this tight-knit group could soon be scattered by the horrors awaiting beyond the trenches. The sounds of the barracks, the creak of wooden floorboards, the rustling of gear, the occasional clatter of metal form a strange kind of music, one that echoes the heartbeat of a generation thrust into a conflict none had truly chosen. Outside, the cheers of civilians and the waving of flags remind you that beyond these walls, the country watches with hope and pride, believing in the promise of a quick, decisive campaign. But within these close quarters, the reality feels different. The uniforms may be neat, and the spirits high, but the soldiers know better than anyone how quickly hope can fade. As the morning wears on and you join the rest of the regiment to march toward the waiting trains, the weight of your pack presses down on your shoulders, the leather straps biting into your skin. Your feet ache from blisters already forming. A small but persistent reminder that this journey will demand more than just courage. The rhythmic pounding of boots on cobblestones blends with the distant sound of patriotic songs sung by your comrades, a soundtrack both haunting and hopeful. You glance around at the faces passing by, some young and eager, eyes bright with belief. Others hardened by training, already shadowed with the fatigue of long days. Despite the hardships, there is an unspoken understanding. Each man carries the burden not just for himself, but for those waiting at home, for the ideals they hold dear, and for the promise that the war will end soon with honor and victory. It is this sense of purpose that threads through the barracks and the marching columns alike, binding strangers into a brotherhood forged by shared hardship and common fate. And yet, beneath this veneer of pride and determination lies a fragile truth. The soldiers are preparing to enter a war unlike any before. A conflict that will test not only their bodies, but their minds, their beliefs, and their very will to survive. The cramped barracks and rough uniforms are only the beginning of a journey into a brutal new world, one where the ordinary man must find extraordinary reserves of strength. As you move forward with your regiment, you carry with you not just your equipment, but the hopes of a nation and the quiet courage of countless others who will stand beside you in the days to come. The path ahead is uncertain, but for now, in this cramped and noisy room filled with the sounds of preparation and anticipation, you steel yourself for the challenge, knowing that what lies ahead will change everything forever. The journey to the front begins not with triumph, but with the steady drum of boots on cobblestone roads, as your regiment, newly uniformed, barely trained, moves toward the border with Belgium. There is tension in the air, but it is cloaked in layers of confidence, even arrogance. Newspapers back home print headlines filled with certainty. Our boys will be home by Christmas, they declare. And many of the men marching beside you believe it. You want to believe it too. The officers speak of a swift campaign, of France faltering under the weight of German precision and power. You have been told the resistance in Belgium will be minimal, a formality on the path to Paris. But the moment your unit crosses into Belgian territory, the tone of the war shifts. Towns that should have been quiet and cooperative erupt in pockets of resistance. Civilians fire from rooftops. Entire buildings are booby-trapped. You begin to hear the word Francs-tireurs, civilian snipers, whispered through the lines, and soon after, orders come down with cold clarity. Respond to all threats with decisive action. The war, so far painted as honorable and orderly in your imagination, begins to fray at the edges. As you advance, the countryside becomes scarred with scorched homes, abandoned farms, and fleeing families. You pass through fields where the golden wheat has been flattened by artillery, where animals have been left behind in panic, their cries echoing through the ruined villages. Your boots are now caked in mud and ash. The romantic visions you once held are dissolving, replaced by an unrelenting sense of fatigue. You sleep in barns, under wagons, or in shallow ditches, the sound of distant shell fire pulsing through your chest like a second heartbeat. In the small town of Dinant, you see what happens when fear and fury collide. The advance is halted by heavy resistance, and when it ends, you witness the devastation left behind. The streets are silent, but smoke rises from homes, still burning. You do not speak of what you saw there, not to your comrades, not even in your own thoughts. Something shifts inside you. You begin to understand that war is not just a test of national strength, but of personal survival. The push through Belgium is slower than promised. Every day brings new delays, new casualties. The roads are clogged with supply wagons and wounded men. The Belgian army, far from being a pushover, has dug in and fights with tenacity. Bridges are destroyed behind them. Rivers become barriers, and rail lines are sabotaged, leaving your column stranded and exposed. Food runs low. Ammunition is rationed. Morale flickers like a candle in the wind. You hear grumbling among the older soldiers, men who have fought before and recognize the signs of a long and bloody campaign. When the German High Command pivots toward the French border, there is renewed hope that the worst is behind you. But even this is short-lived. Near the Marne, the French dig in and launch counterattacks with surprising strength. Their artillery, accurate and relentless, begins to cut through your ranks. You begin to understand that you are not fighting a collapsing opponent, but an enemy just as determined as your own. The dream of Paris, once promised in speeches and song, now seems impossibly far away. Your days become a pattern of forced marches and quick engagements, of digging shallow trenches under fire, of carrying wounded friends to safety while shells scream overhead. You learn to distinguish the sounds of different artillery pieces, to instinctively dive at the whistle of a mortar. You stop writing home as often, unsure of what to say that would not alarm your family. The men around you change too. Some harden. Others become quiet, haunted by what they have seen. By mid-September, the advance stalls completely. You are ordered to entrench, and you begin to dig, unsure whether this will be for days or weeks. You do not yet know. It will last for years. The optimism of August has vanished, replaced by a grim acceptance. The war is not ending soon, and the front has become a line carved into the earth with blood and steel. Evenings are spent cleaning your rifle by candlelight, writing letters that never quite tell the truth, and staring out across no man's land, where enemy trenches lie just a few hundred meters away. You hear French voices carry over the wind. You sometimes imagine the man on the other side is just like you, young, scared, caught in a war far bigger than either of you. There are moments when you forget why you are here. The speeches, the flags, the pride, they all seem so distant now. What remains is the man beside you, the mud underfoot, and the hope that tomorrow you will survive again. The road to France has taught you that no campaign is ever easy, and no war ever clean. And as the first autumn rains begin to fall, turning the earth beneath your trench into a pit of sludge, you realize that the war you joined is not the one you were promised. It is something darker, more enduring, and far more human than anyone ever told you. The dream of a swift, glorious march to Paris had long since faded. What remained was a cold, wet trench carved deep into the battered earth, a maze of mud, wood, and wire that snaked across the countryside like a wound refusing to heal. As a German infantryman now several months into the war, you had become part of this living organism, the Western Front. The optimism that had filled the hearts of many in August now lay buried under the weight of endless days and sleepless nights. The trenches were not simply ditches dug into the soil, they were entire worlds unto themselves. Constructed in layers, the German trenches were known for their complexity and depth. Wooden planks lined the walls, sandbags stacked high-formed protective barriers, and duckboards covered the floor in a vain attempt to keep the mud at bay. Each level served a different purpose: frontline fire trenches for direct combat, support trenches for reinforcements, and communication trenches to shuttle men, orders, and supplies between the chaos and the rear. Yet, no matter how meticulously engineered they were, the trenches were never truly safe. The moment you descended into the trench, you entered another reality. The smell was the first thing to hit, an unrelenting mix of damp earth, sweat, oil, rotting food, and something else that no one dared name. Rats thrived here, growing fat on discarded rations, and the unspoken tragedies left too long in no man's land. They darted between boots, chewed through uniforms, and grew so bold they sometimes curled up beside sleeping soldiers for warmth. The sounds were ever present. Distant shell fire rumbling like a thunderstorm that never moved on. The sharp crack of rifle fire. The shriek of artillery overhead. And the low moans of the wounded that never quite left the air. Silence, when it came, was not peace, but a terrifying void. An indication that something worse was on its way. Daily life in the trenches was a cycle of vigilance and exhaustion. Sleep came in short bursts, if at all, interrupted by night watches, incoming barrages, or the bark of an officer preparing for a trench raid. Meals consisted of black bread, tinned meat, and the occasional thin soup ladled from grimy pots. Coffee was a rare comfort, and clean water scarcer still. Your uniform, once pressed and proud, was now a second skin of sweat and grime, the wool stiff and chafing, your boots caked in filth that never quite dried. Letters from home offered brief relief words from a mother, a sweetheart, or a friend, recalling a world that seemed impossibly distant. You read and reread them until the paper wore thin, folding them carefully into your pocket as if they were amulets against the madness creeping at the edges of your thoughts. Yet even these fragments of normalcy could not mask the reality that you and your comrades were living in the space between life and death. Fear was constant, but not always panicked. It was quieter, more insidious. A fear of being picked off by a sniper's bullet if you lifted your head too high above the parapet. A fear of gas, colorless, drifting silently over the trench wall, sinking into the lowest points where soldiers huddled for safety. You slept with your gas mask nearby, always, knowing that even a moment's delay could be the difference between life and a slow, choking death. And then there was the mud. It swallowed everything: boots, rifles, men. After a night of rain, entire sections of the trench would collapse, and digging them out meant hours of back-breaking labor, with frozen fingers and fraying nerves. The mud worked its way into every fold of your clothes, every crevice of your body, turning skin raw and leaving wounds that refused to heal. Trench foot was a common affliction. Soldiers watched their toes blacken and rot, helpless unless evacuated in time. Despite it all, there was a strange kind of solidarity here. You knew the men beside you, their habits, their stories, the cadence of their breath when they slept. You learned to read a face in the dark, to share a smoke in silence, to recognize when someone was close to breaking and quietly shoulder more of the burden without needing to speak. Humor, often grim, was a shield. It deflected fear, even if just for a moment. Songs were sung, poems composed, games played with whatever was at hand. Humanity flickered stubbornly, even here. And the enemy, he lived in a trench just like yours, not far across the barbed wire. Sometimes, in rare moments of quiet, You heard voices, snatches of laughter, or shouted orders in the same language as yours. They were boys, too, mostly, drawn from farms, factories, and cities, promised honor and glory and given mud and blood instead. On Christmas Eve, a strange silence had descended. And then music, a carol, faint at first, then louder. Candles glowed across no man's land. You had joined in, not with weapons, but with song. And for one night, the war had paused, and hands had shaken where rifles usually fired. But it did not last. The war resumed, as wars do. The trenches deepened, the bodies mounted, and the hope of an early end faded into the mist. Still, you held your rifle and stayed your post. You lived hour by hour, day by day, in a world carved from earth and forged in fear. You did not know if tomorrow would come, but you knew the man beside you would be there, and together you would face whatever the next sunrise brought. It was late December, and the bitter cold clung to everything, the ground frozen hard beneath worn boots, the air sharp with each breath drawn through layers of wool and dirt. You had long since grown used to the routines of trench life, to the ever-present mud, the uneasy sleep interrupted by distant artillery, and the constant haze of dread that something, anything, could happen at any moment. Yet as Christmas approached, something peculiar began to stir along the Western Front, something neither side had anticipated nor planned. It started subtly. One evening, as the pale winter sun dipped below the horizon, faint sounds floated across no man's land. Not the familiar rumble of gunfire, but something softer, melodic. Stille Nacht, you heard, rising gently from the opposite trench. For a moment, it seemed unreal. Then another voice joined in, and soon there was a chorus of German soldiers singing in unison, their voices echoing across the icy wasteland. From the British line came a hesitant response. Silent Night. The melody was the same, only the words different. In that moment, a strange calm settled, as if the battlefield itself was holding its breath. By morning, the unimaginable was unfolding. German and British soldiers cautiously emerged from their trenches, unarmed and open-handed. You stood from your muddy shelter, heart racing, not with fear, but with uncertainty. Across the frozen ground you saw men enemy soldiers doing the same, hands raised, voices calling out greetings, some even laughing. There were gestures of goodwill, small smiles shared between men who, just days ago, had been aiming rifles at each other. In the middle of that desolate land, you met eyes with a British soldier no older than yourself. His uniform was just as tattered, his face just as weary. And yet, you both smiled. There were handshakes, exchanges of food and cigarettes, even buttons or insignia swapped as souvenirs. Someone produced a football, a real ball, scuffed and dirty but intact, and suddenly there was a game. Boots thudded against the frozen earth, laughter rang out, and for the first time in months, the sounds of war were replaced with something human. You watched men who had once been nameless targets become real. You learned a few English words, and your counterpart struggled through broken German. There was no grand speech, no declaration of peace, just small, quiet moments, a shared cigarette, a photo of a sweetheart passed around, a chuckle over bad coffee. In the space of a few hours, the front line felt like anything, but yet you knew it could not last. Officers began to appear, urging men back to their posts. Some allowed the truce to stretch into the following day, while others quickly re-established order. The reality of war would not be held at bay forever. But as you returned to your trench, you carried something with you, an understanding that those on the other side were not monsters, but young men just like you. Men with families, hopes, and fears who never asked for this conflict either. Back in the silence of the dugout, you sat with your back to the earth wall and stared at the stars above the wire. The truce was over, and soon the shells would start again. But the memory of that day stayed, not because it was grand, but because it was human. In the middle of so much destruction, a fragile, fleeting act of peace had bloomed unsanctioned, spontaneous, and deeply real. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest truth of all, that peace was possible, even in war, that behind every uniform was a man, and that sometimes, even if only for a moment, the heart remembers what politics and orders try to make us forget. The days begin to blend into one another, a relentless cycle of gray skies, rain-soaked mud, and the endless echo of artillery. Life in the trenches is not just a test of strength, but of spirit. You and your comrades huddle in the damp earthworks, surrounded by sandbags, wooden planks, and the ever-present stench of rot and damp wool. The mud is everywhere, caked to your boots, seeping through your socks, clinging to your hands, and even to the metal of your rifle. There is no escaping it. Even when you try to sleep, the ground beneath your body is wet, the cold cutting through your uniform like a blade. Every moment is a struggle against fatigue. Sleep comes only in fragments, stolen in the hours between shellings. Your body aches constantly, not from one wound or trauma, but from the sheer wear and tear of existence. Carrying your gear through the muck, crouching in firing positions for hours, or just trying to stay upright during a shift of sentry duty, all of it takes its toll. Yet even amid the exhaustion, vigilance is necessary. One slip of attention could mean death, a sniper's bullet, a surprise raid, or the sudden hiss of gas. Gas, it is a new kind of fear, unlike anything you imagined back in August. The moment someone yells gas, panic ripples through the line. You fumble for your mask, heart pounding, hands trembling. The masks itch and stink of rubber and old chemicals, but they are the only thing between you and suffocation. Sometimes the wind changes and carries the poison away. Other times it creeps into the dugouts, clinging to the air like fog. Men cough for hours afterward, their eyes red and streaming. Some never recover. Despite the danger, the worst enemy is not always the bullets or gas. It is the waiting. The endless hours of silence between battles are filled with anticipation, dread, and the weight of your own thoughts. Letters from home arrive sporadically, some bringing joy, others sorrow. You see comrades break down after reading that a brother was killed or that crops failed back in the village. You nod quietly, sharing their pain without words, because tomorrow it might be your turn to open a letter and feel your world shift. Morale is a delicate thing. Officers do what they can, occasional hot meals, a few hours of rest behind the lines, new boots or woolen socks, but none of it erases the truth. You are trapped in a war that no longer resembles what you were told. Gone is the dream of a swift campaign. In its place is this endless grind. Still, you cling to small rituals, cleaning your rifle, sharing a cigarette, humming a song from home. These fragments of normal life become anchors, holding you together when everything else is falling apart. The equipment you carry becomes an extension of yourself. Your rifle is always clean, your boots as dry as you can manage, your bayonet sharp, not because you expect to use it every day, but because preparation gives you a sense of control. Each morning you check your gear as if it might somehow protect you from the chaos outside. And in a way it does. Routine becomes a shield against despair. Still, nothing shields you from the sounds, the deep rumble of distant shelling, the sharp cracks of rifles, or the haunting cries of the wounded. At night, when it is quiet, the silence is heavy, almost worse than the noise. You lie awake, listening for footsteps in the trench, for whispers of a surprise attack, for the sudden rush that means someone has triggered an alarm wire. Fear is always present, never shouting, just breathing quietly in the back of your mind. Sometimes you wonder how long this will go on. You think of the promises made by politicians and generals, of parades and flags and songs of victory. Now those seem like fragments from another life. Out here, reality is far more complex, and survival has become the only goal that matters. Yet even as your world narrows to the width of a trench and the length of a bayonet, you hold on to something deeper. The bonds forged in the mud are unlike any others. You and the men beside you are more than soldiers. You are brothers now, bound not by blood but by the shared burden of endurance. You nod to one another without speaking, passing along a tin of food or a flask of schnapps, and when the time comes to go over the top, to climb the ladders and face whatever waits beyond the wire, you do it together, not for medals or honor, but because the man beside you will do it too. And so the days grind on. The front remains static, but within the lines, every hour brings new challenges. You learn to find meaning, not in orders or politics, but in survival, in duty, and in the moments of humanity that somehow persist amid the chaos of war. By 1917, the dream of a swift and decisive victory had long since vanished. What had begun as a confident march through Belgium had hardened into years of blood-soaked mud and haunting silence between barrages. You are no longer the same soldier who once stood in pressed uniform beneath fluttering flags and grand speeches. Now your tunic is stained with earth and time. Your boots barely hold together, and the faces around you have changed far too often. But amid this endless struggle, whispers begin to circulate through the trenches, whispers of something new. The old ways have failed. Time and again, entire battalions are ordered to climb from their dugouts, charge across a hellish expanse of no man's land, only to be torn apart by machine gun fire or swallowed by shell craters. The generals, watching from maps and planning halls, speak of tactics and objectives. But down in the muck it is clear, the war has changed, and change must come with it. It starts in quiet murmurs about special unit shock troops, selected for speed, for adaptability, for ferocity. They call them Stoßtruppen, or stormtroopers. Unlike the slow, rigid formations of years past, these men are trained to move fast, to exploit weaknesses, to break through the enemy's fragile points and cause chaos from within. They carry lighter gear, grenades for close-quarters assaults, and often work in small squads rather than massive waves. You hear of their success at the Battle of Riga, where German stormtroopers bypassed Russian strongpoints and advanced deep behind their lines. For the first time in years, breakthroughs seem possible. There is something electric in the air, even through the omnipresent stench of rot and damp cloth. You are no longer just waiting now. You are training, learning new techniques, handling unfamiliar equipment. Instructors speak of infiltration tactics, of surprise, of outmaneuvering rather than overwhelming the enemy. When the time comes, you are assigned to one of these new units, and though the fear never fades, a strange excitement begins to build. But the war is not just changing on your side. One day, far down the line, word spreads. The British have unveiled something monstrous. An armored behemoth that rolls over trenches and barbed wire with mechanical indifference. The tank. At first, it seems like a curiosity, a gimmick that breaks down more than it works. But over time, its presence becomes a factor you cannot ignore. These machines are evolving heavier armor, more guns, greater speed. The battlefield is no longer defined solely by mud and rifle. The sound of one is unforgettable, like metal grinding on stone, coupled with the roar of engines. You have seen the fear they inspire, not just in enemy ranks, but among your comrades. A man with a rifle cannot stop a tank. Artillery and anti-tank rifles are rushed to the front, but the sense of imbalance lingers. It is a new kind of war, one you never trained for back in 1914. Still, the stormtrooper doctrine adapts. Tanks may break lines, but storm units exploit the chaos they leave behind. You begin to operate like hunters, using smoke, silence, and speed. Attacks now come at dawn, with carefully coordinated artillery barrages followed by infiltration teams moving under cover. You are not charging blindly anymore. You are calculating, striking like a knife rather than a hammer. The spring offensive of 1918 becomes the pinnacle of this evolution. Germany throws its remaining strength into a series of offensives aimed at breaking the deadlock before American troops arrive. In overwhelming numbers, you are there, part of the initial waves. The attacks are terrifying in their intensity. Artillery crashes down like thunder. Shock troops pour through breaches. And for the first time in years, you see real ground gained. Villages fall. Trenches are overrun. The enemy retreats, shocked by the new ferocity, but victory remains elusive. Supplies strain. Exhaustion eats at every success. For every kilometer gained, the price is unbearable. The Allies adapt quickly, bringing in reinforcements, shifting tactics, and deploying tanks in greater numbers with coordinated infantry support. The breakthrough never becomes the collapse that was hoped for, and you feel it, that creeping sense that, despite everything, the clock is ticking against you. Even so, these months stand apart. After so much stagnant horror, there is movement, ambition, fire. You are not simply surviving. You are part of something bold, something modern. Yet, in quiet moments, sitting behind a crumbled wall or crouched in a shell hole at dusk, you wonder if any of it will be enough. If all these innovations, stormtroopers, creeping barrages, armored war beasts, are simply new ways of painting old tragedies. The men around you do not talk of politics anymore. They do not talk of glory, only of home, of mothers and wives, of the food they will eat and the silence they crave. Every new tactic offers hope, but hope now comes at a high cost. And still, orders come. The next push is prepared. Your unit sharpens blades, inspects grenades, maps routes through wire and ruin. You adjust your gas mask, double-check your pistol. Somewhere in the dark ahead, the enemy does the same. This is the modern war. A chessboard soaked in blood, where pawns move faster, knights strike quicker, but the kings are still out of reach. And you are still here. A soldier transformed not only by the uniforms you wear or the weapons you carry, but by the war that reshaped everything you once knew. The influenza crept into the trenches not like an enemy announced by the thunder of shells, but like a whisper, a cough passed from man to man, unnoticed until it was too late. In the spring of 1918, as you stood among your comrades, your uniform already damp with the sweat of fatigue and the mud of another sleepless night, the coughing began. First it was a few men, then dozens, then nearly half your unit. What began as whispers turned into waves of fever, chills, and unbearable weakness. You had already grown used to the threat of bullets and shrapnel, but this was different. There was no clear line, no place to hide, no enemy to fire back at. Just a sickness that seemed to crawl through every trench wall, every mess tin, every breath of stale, lice-ridden air. You remember one morning waking to the sound of a man vomiting beside you, his body trembling violently. His name was Otto. Just yesterday, he had been laughing about a letter from his sister. Now his eyes were sunken and glazed, his breath shallow, his lips blue. You helped carry him to the field hospital, or what passed for one, only to find a line already snaking out of the dugout. Men sprawled in the mud with blood at their nostrils, unable even to speak. The overwhelmed medics had no answers. Morphine was gone, bandages scarce, beds full. They tried their best, but the war had long drained even their spirit. Many soldiers, too weak to lift their heads, lay curled on the floor under scraps of canvas, fever burning through their bodies as the din of distant artillery faded into the background. Command offered little. Orders continued to flow, hold the line, rotate units, keep the pressure on, but it became harder to distinguish between the casualties of combat and the casualties of illness. The ground you once defended with rifle and bayonet now seemed more like a mass grave. Trenches that had resisted shelling for months were now choked with the bodies of the fevered dead. Rats, already your nightly tormentors, grew bolder, fattened on the abundance of flesh. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of rot, sickness, and fear. You wrapped your scarf around your face, not only for the stench, but in the futile hope of keeping the illness at bay. There were rumors the illness had started far away, in camps back home, maybe even in America. But what did it matter? The front was a perfect breeding ground filth, overcrowding, malnourishment, and the ever-present damp. Everyone was vulnerable, even the strongest among you. One day you watched a sergeant, the man who had pulled you from no man's land after a raid, slump against the trench wall and simply stop breathing. No screams, no drama, just quiet surrender. You did not even know his first name. Despite it all, you continued. Routines persisted. Sentry duty, cleaning your rifle, eating what little food you were given, writing letters you were not sure would ever be delivered. You even found yourself, absurdly, praying not so much for safety but for clarity, for understanding. What kind of war continued to kill even when the guns went quiet? What kind of peace would be left for the few who survived? By late autumn, the fever had begun to recede. Just as the war itself teetered toward its final days, you could feel the shift in the air. There were fewer orders to attack, fewer barrages. Even the birds seemed to sing again. But the losses were too heavy to celebrate. Where once your trench had held 40 men, now barely a dozen remained. Many, like you, had survived both bullets and fever, though not without cost. Some coughed blood, others walked with limps. All of you carried a hollowness that no armistice could erase. In a notebook salvaged from a fallen officer, you scribbled something that still sticks with you. We learned to fear death when it had a face. Now we fear it when it wears ours. The pandemic did not wear a uniform, did not march with flags, did not sign treaties. It simply came and took. And when it left, it did so quietly, almost respectfully, as if it knew the war had already done enough. You emerged from the trench, thinner, quieter, your hands shaking more than before. The war may have been ending, but the memory of it, of the nights beside burning fevers, of the friends buried without ceremony, of Otto's last breath would stay. You had not just survived battle. You had survived a sickness that would go on to claim millions across the world. But unlike war, no monument would be raised for its victims in the trench. Only memory and silence. By November 1918, everything had changed. The thunder of distant artillery, once a constant rhythm of life in the trenches, was replaced by a strange and almost disorienting silence. You, a weary German soldier who had survived 4 grueling years of war, stood not in victory, but in quiet disbelief. The order had come. Lay down your arms. The war was over, but there was no celebration, no cheers of triumph, just the hollow echo of surrender. You and your comrades emerged from the trenches that had been your home for so long, their muddy walls carved into your memory as deeply as the scars on your body and mind. The rumors had begun weeks earlier, Austria-Hungary collapsing, the Kaiser's hold weakening, the Allies pushing ever closer. When word finally reached your unit, it was not through a grand speech or ceremonial decree, but whispered in broken voices delivered by officers who themselves looked lost. Germany had requested an armistice. The war to end all wars had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, reluctant agreement. As you marched back through devastated villages and cratered fields, the scale of loss settled in. Whole towns were gone, families shattered. The faces of civilians you passed were not ones of welcome, but of exhaustion and uncertainty. In some places there were jeers and bitter glares. The uniform you wore no longer symbolized strength. It had become a symbol of defeat, of suffering, and for some, of blame. Arriving back in Germany did not bring the comfort you hoped for. The Kaiser had abdicated and fled. The monarchy dissolved overnight. A republic had risen, almost as if by accident, led by factions struggling for control in Berlin's streets. The chaos that had gripped the front now echoed in the capital. Revolution had erupted in the navy. Strikes paralyzed cities. Political posters plastered walls. beside notices of food shortages and funeral announcements. The nation you had left behind was not the one you returned to. Worse still was the silence from those who once supported the war. In 1914, you had marched under banners, cheered by crowds promising glory and a quick victory. Now, no one spoke of those early days. The newspapers no longer printed poems about heroism. Instead, they debated blame, speculated about peace terms, and argued over the harsh demands coming from the Allies in Paris. As a returning soldier, you found yourself suspended between two worlds, too changed by war to simply return to who you were, yet not ready to embrace this new Germany, where so much was unfamiliar. Many of your fellow soldiers wandered the streets without work, some forming militia groups, others simply disappearing into the countryside. You heard stories of uprisings, communist councils seizing towns, Freikorps units fighting to restore order. You felt the pull in every direction. Join the cause, reject it, forget it all, or cling to what little remained of the old world. The scars of war were not just visible in ruined buildings or missing limbs. They lived in the sleepless nights, the sudden loud noises that triggered panic, the empty chair at the family table. Your father, once proud of your service, now avoided your gaze. Your mother wept when she thought you could not hear. Your younger brother did not understand why you stared blankly out the window for hours, or why you kept waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering names of men long dead. And then came the peace terms. When news broke of the Treaty of Versailles being signed, it struck like a second defeat. Harsh reparations, territorial losses, military restrictions. The blame for the entire war laid at Germany's feet. You remembered the mud, the comrades you had buried, the orders you had followed without question, and now the entire world claimed it was all your fault. You wondered, as many did, if the sacrifice had meant anything at all. But in the quiet corners of society, amid the uncertainty and despair, something else stirred. Small acts of rebuilding. Neighbors helping neighbors. Veterans forming clubs not to plot violence, but to find community. Painters and writers began capturing the war not as legend, but as trauma, as truth. Some turned to politics, others to art or religion. You found solace in simply surviving. Each day, walking through the park, writing letters you never sent, and trying, piece by piece, to rediscover your own humanity. You did not speak much of the war. When people asked, you gave short answers, not because you did not remember, but because you remembered everything. Every cry for help, every morning roll call that came up one name short, every moment of camaraderie, of absurd humor in the trenches, of sharing a cigarette under fire. And most of all, you remembered the silence of that final day, the day it all stopped. The war had ended, but the questions remained. Who were you now? A survivor, a witness, a man haunted by what he had seen, or defined by how he would live afterward? You did not know the answers, but in that fragile peace, amid a broken Germany, you tried to find them. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world exhaled, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Millions had perished. Cities lay in ruin. And those who returned from the front lines carried far more than just their uniforms. They bore invisible scars etched deep within their minds, a weight that no metal could ease and no words could truly express. For the men who survived, the end of war did not mean the end of suffering. Peace, though long prayed for, brought its own set of challenges. The journey home was not just about crossing borders, but navigating a vastly changed inner world. They stepped off the trains and transports, not into the lives they would left behind, but into a new reality where nothing felt familiar. Families had mourned them prematurely, communities had moved on without them, and many found themselves strangers in their own homes. Haunted by memories of relentless shell fire, the stench of decaying trenches, and the cries of wounded comrades, These veterans faced a silent war no one else could see. Nightmares disrupted sleep. Sudden noises triggered panic, and moments of silence felt heavier than the loudest bombardment. In a time before terms like PTSD were recognized, many were dismissed as shell-shocked, misunderstood by society, and left to wrestle with their trauma and solitude. Rebuilding life meant starting from scratch, often with broken bodies, limited resources, and fading hope. Some turned to alcohol to dull the pain. Others withdrew entirely, unable to relate to a world that had never known the trenches. And yet, among the despair, there were also glimmers of resilience. Some found solace in routine, in returning to the soil as farmers, or rebuilding war-torn towns with their own hands. Others sought meaning in community, in supporting fellow veterans, or in writing and speaking about their experiences, hoping their voices might shape a better world. Countries, too, had to rebuild not just in brick and mortar, but in conscience. Governments grappled with how to support their returning soldiers, how to honor sacrifice without glorifying violence, and how to prevent such a catastrophe from ever repeating. War memorials were erected, names etched into cold stone to preserve the memory of those lost, but even these could not convey the full weight of what millions endured. For those who had served, healing was not linear. It came in fragments, in the touch of a loved one's hand, in the laughter of a child unaware of the past, or in the simple act of planting a tree where once there was mud and wire. They had survived not just bullets and bombs, but the unraveling of the human spirit. Now they had to find a way to stitch themselves back together thread by thread, moment by moment. And so, as we reflect on their journey from the fear-filled trenches to uncertain peace, we are reminded that survival is more than endurance. It is the quiet courage to keep going, to rebuild, to believe in joy again, even when joy feels foreign. Their stories remind us not only of the horrors of war, but of the unyielding strength of the human heart. If this story moved you, I invite you to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who values history and the quiet resilience of those who lived it. Your support helps keep these stories alive and heard by future generations. Thank you for listening, and until we meet again, sleep well and dream of peace.